Good afternoon. Welcome to our AGBU Museum. My name is Aram Goshen, and we're very honored to have a very distinguished guest today, Dr. Boris Adjemian from AGBU Library from Paris. I would say that this is the third visit of Dr. Boris Adjemian. We're always delighted to have him amongst us at our AGBU Museum. Just for housekeeping, I'm going to make brief announcements, and then I will invite our Dr. Anna Alexandrian to introduce our speaker. Today's event is collaborated with the Province Armenian Institute, and the deputy is here, Hasmik Magdasarian, by National Organization, National Association for Boston. And I want to thank Mark Mamigonian for helping me out with today's program, and also with the Society of Armenian Studies, one of the oldest journals that was housed by the only individual that I can think of is Dr. Richard Hovanesian in the 70s, and today a lot of our future scholars are benefiting from this journal, and I'm sure that he's watching us over now, what we'll say here. Just for housekeeping as well and announcements, Dr. Boris also will give two additional lectures at UCLA next week on Thursday, March the 6th, and that will be at 5 o'clock. It's called The Brand Band of the King Armenians in Ethiopia. It will be at UCLA Schoenberg Music Building, room 1230. And it's organized by Modern Armenian History and Armenian Music Program. And on Friday, March the 7th, same time, same organization. The title is Writer and Witness Aram Andonian and Early Narratives on the Armenian Genocide by Dr. Boris Adjemian. And it's at the Bunch Hall, room 6275. It's at 5 p.m. also. Tomorrow we do have a webinar organized by Mark Nasser in the museum. And I have to say it's at 9 in the morning Pacific time because it's in Europe, it's Armenia, it's the United States. The hours is a little bit different. And the subject is Genetic Insights into the Origin of Armenians by Smurfit Institute of Genetics, Trinity College, Dublin, and Dr. Levon Episkopoussian, Institute of Molecular Biology, National Academy. So that's tomorrow's webinar, and there are flyers out there if you are interested. You can sign in for the Zoom. I would like to invite Dr. Anna Alexandrian. I have to say a few words about Anna. We have been very fortunate to have her at the Artist Legion Museum for the last year and a half. She's been assisting us on a major project that we have been working on. And without Anna's assistance, we couldn't have accomplished it. She is currently at the Province Armenian Institute as a postdoctoral researcher under Professor Padorak's Genocide Program. And I would like to welcome Anna to introduce our speaker. Thank you. Please make sure that your phones are off. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Thank you, Maggie, for your presentation. So it is my absolute privilege today to present Dr. Boris Adjemian, who is a historian and the director of the AGBU Noubar Library in Paris, France. He holds a PhD in history from the School of Advanced Studies in Social Sciences, France, and Università degli Studi di Napoli, Orientale, Italy. His research focuses on the history of diaspora, migration, and memories of mass violence. He is the author of several books, and he is the editor-in-chief of the bilingual multidisciplinary Journal of Contemporary Armenian Studies. And currently he is an adjunct lecturer of the American University of Paris, where he teaches a course on Armenian genocide history. And we are fortunate today to have him here and to deliver a lecture about the library and Noubar Library and the very important Armenian survivor and librarian Aram Andonian. So the history of Noubar Library, founded in Paris in 1927, is linked to Aram Andonian, a former Armenian journalist and a survivor of the Armenian genocide who ended up in Paris in this library. And library came his life until his death in 1951. And today, Dr. Adjemian will share a very important but a small history of that library during the Nazi period when they occupied library and looted it. And please help me to welcome Dr. Adjemian so he will give his lecture. Thank you.
Hello, you hear me well? Thank you. So thank you once again, Maggie, for all you've done for me since 2017. So yeah, we know each other now, we can say. And I'm always enjoying the friendship and hospitality of Maggie and Thomas and Karina and Christina at their place. Yeah, I must say, although, and I know many people, many nice people in Los Angeles, but I'm always very happy to come back. Although I really think that Los Angeles is a complete rentanote. I know so many nice people there. Yeah, it's important for me to be here. And thank you very much, Anna, for this introduction. I know Anna also for a long time now. She's a very close friend. She's a brilliant scholar. And I'm really honored that she introduced my speech today. And as Anna said, I'm working, these last years I was working on the history of the Armenian library in Paris. The first time I came, actually, I gave a lecture at the invitation of Maggie on the history of this library, but at the time, in a way, I was cheating because I knew very few things about the history of the library. I knew the basic lines, but since then, I have improved my knowledge, and I've just released a book, a big book on the history of this library, which is a unique place, especially focusing on the period when Aram Andonian, this important man, very important man, survivor of the genocide, was at the head of the library. So this book has just been released this week in France. It's in French. I hope that it will be translated soon, and I hope that I will present it another day here also in Los Angeles and in this chapel. For the time being, so I will focus rather on a specific period, as Anna said, about the period when the Germans occupied Paris and tried to seize, to occupy also the Noubarian library, this Armenian library in Paris. But for this, as a kind of introduction to the matter, I need to give some background information on the history of this institution in order to explain how important it was to its founders and why the prospects of its being looted by the Germans during World War II seemed so critical to them. So sorry for those who were here in 2017. Some things you already heard will be repeated in the introduction of this presentation. I must also tell you about Aram Andonian, who from the very beginning designed the library in every detail. He became the soul of the library because we call it the Noubarian library or the Noubar library because it was founded at the initiative of Boris Noubar, the famous Boris Noubar. But the man inside the place was Aram Andonian. So he became the linchpin and the soul of this library. He remained in charge of the library until his death at the end of December 1951. So the establishment of the Armenian Library of Paris was the result of a decision taken in 1927 by the Central Council, the Central Board of the Armenian General Benevolent Union, the AGBU. As you may know, the headquarters, the Central Board of the AGBU at the time was in Paris. The AGBU was founded in Egypt, in Cairo in 1906. Then it moved to Paris after the war, after World War I. And when the Germans occupied France and Paris, the headquarters moved to New York, okay, where it is now today. But at the time I'm speaking about, this was the time when the Central Board was in Paris, and it was installed, this office of the AGBU was housed in a beautiful Art Deco building, which is here, which was designed by an Armenian architect. I thought it was organized by the Turkish embassy. As it happens sometimes when you have technical problems. Always think to the possibility of their involvement in these problems. So, since it is so this building here, Art Deco, beautiful building, which is not blue anymore, and which was designed by an Armenian architect, Levon Nafilian, who was from Constantinople. He built some buildings in Constantinople, also in Egypt, several buildings in Paris. By the way, Asbet, did you know he also designed the Armenian church in Addis Ababa? Yeah, I happened to learn it recently. At the time, so this building was built in 1922, not only by this Armenian architect, but at the initiative of an Armenian group of entrepreneurs, among them Boris himself. So this building is a very beautiful building now in Paris. You have here the Luba Library, the reading room, and this was built in 1922. But the library was not there yet. In the 1925-26, there was a family, the heirs of Vicen Holas, a wealthy Catholic Armenian from Constantinople, who died before the war, but who owned a particularly rich collection, private collection of books. So the books were in his house in Constantinople, and his daughters wanted to give them, to offer them as a gift to the AGBU in Paris, on the condition that the organization will make them accessible to the widest possible audience through the creation of an Armenian public library. So the AGBU at the time hesitated for several months before accepting the donation, as the potential running costs of such a library seemed too high for the organization, which had, of course, many more priorities at the time, with the refugees, with the orphans in the Middle East. Finally, the president of the AGBU, Boris Lubar, where is Boris Lubar? Here. He decided to buy a flat, an apartment, in the same building on the Square Alboni in Paris, in this building, which is located in the 16th arrondissement district of Paris, near the Trocadero, near the Eiffel Tower. And so he offered this flat to the AGBU as a gift for the creation of this Armenian library, which would include as a starter the books of this wealthy Armenian from Constantinople, Vicen Holas. He also, Boris Lubar, donated his personal collection of Armenian books. Thus, the decision was taken to create a library. It was then called the Armenian National Library of Paris. I think հայերենով Parisi Հայկական Ազգային Մատենատարան, which is very interesting because it means that the National Library, the Armenian National Library at the time, was conceived in Paris. It was located not in Armenia, but in Paris, in the Spuri, in the diaspora. After the death of Boris Lubar in 1930, so 3 years after the founding of the library, he died, and the library was renamed after the founder. So it became the Lubar Library, or Lubarian Madenataran. And immediately after the first donations, so I'm going back to Vicen Holas, this very important collector collectioner, I don't know, who gave, whose daughters, sorry, gave his books. Several thousands of books that are in the library now. After this donation, primary donation, there were other important donations by several people like Mikhail Pasha Portugalian, Alexander Harens, Carlos Gulbenkian himself, often people from Constantinople, from wealthy Armenian merchants of Constantinople, because of course at the time, even though they were merchants, even though they were senior officials and had important function, they were also people who liked to read, and everyone had, all rich people of this upper society had his private library, so they were very interested by this aspect. So strikingly, the library was founded at a time when the dream of an Armenian national homeland in the Middle East was fading away and even collapsed after the French withdrawal of Cilicia, as if the new institution was to serve as a kind of symbolic territory for the nation in exile. The purpose of the establishment of this new institution was to create the possibility of a national revival after the genocide and the destruction of most of the Armenian cultural heritage in the Ottoman Empire. In this context, it is significant, and it was decisive, that the first librarian appointed by Boris himself to head the library was Aram Andonian, a former journalist and well-known writer from Constantinople, who had miraculously survived the genocide after being arrested on 24 April 1915 and subsequently deported to the Syrian desert. In the second half of his life, so after 1919, after World War I, he moved to Paris, never came back to Constantinople, and he worked there for the Armenian National Delegation, headed also by Boris and also having its headquarters in Paris, and as an employee. And then he worked for the AGBU, still as an employee, and he devoted himself to the development of the Armenian library after its creation. A few words about Andonian again. Although Andonian is best known to the public, Andonian is here. Aram Andonian, although he is best known to the public as the man who published several Ottoman telegrams. You must have heard about this story. He published several Ottoman telegrams in 1919, 1920, incriminating the leaders of the Committee for Union and Progress, the so-called Young Turks, in the annihilation of the Armenians. It is important to know what Andonian was before the genocide and what he did after the genocide. In fact, the life of the library was so closely linked to Aram Andonian that writing the history of the library is almost tantamount to writing Aram Andonian's biography. Between 1927 and 1951, the library became Andonian's main preoccupation, the major work of the second half of his life. Although he remained a modest employee of the AGBU and most of his work remained unknown to the public, Andonian was the one who collected, copied, and classified so many books, archives, manuscripts, newspapers, and periodicals, and also autographed documents and photographs that form the core of the Noubar Library's collection today. In the late 1920s and 1930s, thanks to the encouragement of the AGBU Central Board, and thanks to the tireless work of the librarian, Aram Andonian, the library received a very significant number of donations of books and archives, both from individuals and institutions. The nerve centers of these donations were first Egypt, Cairo and Alexandria, where the AGBU was well established for historical reasons. And even more so Constantinople, Istanbul, from where many Armenians and Armenian institutions tended to send their books and archives abroad in order to escape the harsh restrictions imposed by the Kemalist regime after 1923, on any visible expression of Armenian cultural identity. So after 1923, after World War I, it was not conceivable to develop such an Armenian cultural center, such a library in Constantinople, which would have been the first place to develop it before the war, but so it had to be developed in exile. Thus, in less than a decade, the Nubar Library had rapidly grown to become one of the 4 major Armenian libraries in the diaspora, along with the militarist libraries of Venice, Venedig, and Vienna, and the important collections of the Armenian Patriarchate of Jerusalem. So you have still today in the diaspora 4 important, very important libraries, main libraries, which are Venice, Vienna, Jerusalem, and Paris. The specificity of the Paris library is that it is not a monastery, an ecclesiastic library. During this period, the political situation in the USSR was too unstable, and the cultural institutions of Soviet Armenia were not strong enough to attract such donations of books. As a result, the books that were most often printed in Constantinople, Alexandria, Aleppo, Beirut, Bucharest, Boston, Paris, and the like, tended to remain in the diaspora. They were not sent to Armenia as it would be the case today. They were sent to Paris. They were sent to the Armenian National Library of Paris. And the very nature of the project to create a so-called National Armenian Library in Paris, although it seems strange today, how can it be a National Armenian Library if it's not in Armenia? Reflected at the time the lively debate about the possibility of a competing existence of a distant Hellenic in Soviet Armenia and the numerous multiple Armenian colonies, Kahut, in the diaspora. I mean, the debates that we have today between the diaspora and the existence of the diaspora, the existence of the homeland. What is the homeland? Is it in the diaspora or is it in the Hellenic? Is it in Armenia? These kind of debates were very vivid in the 1920s as well. The founders of the AGBU and many intellectuals living in the diaspora, such as, for example, the famous Arshak Chobanyan, the writer who was living in Paris, argued that the creation of such institutions in the colonies, in the Kahut, in the Sput, in the diaspora, was not in contradiction at all with the national project. I think you could be national being in the diaspora. On the contrary, they considered that the donations made by Boris Nubar to the Armenian Library in Paris, and at the same time, for instance, to the Maison des Étudiants Arméniens, Boris Nubar created also the same year, the very same year that he created the Nubar Library, he created in Paris also the High Husanov Nerudun for the Armenian students in the international city, Cité Universitaire Internationale de Paris. Well, you can translate yourself. And for them, for these intellectuals and also for people like Boris Nubar, these were important achievements for the future of the Armenian nation, because it was about culture, it was about education, it was about language. Very strikingly, Boris Nubar himself, you may know that Boris Nubar, although he was raised in a country where Armenians were numerous, in his family they were educated in French. He was the son of a former prime minister of Egypt. It was a big family, a dynasty. But his knowledge of Armenian was not, he was not comfortable enough in Armenian. He could not write and read in Armenian, for instance. But he attached great importance to the development of the Armenian language in the diaspora among the youth, among the students, and the fact that they would not forget the language of their parents and grandparents, because this was considered as the future of the nation. The existence of the nation was not separated from the existence of a culture. And at the time it was crucial to protect the culture, because if you erase the culture, there is no hope. So you can also think to the current debates at the light of these old considerations. This rapid development of the library, which reached a number of 20,000 books at the end of the 1930s, so in less than 10 years, starting from zero, this rapid development was jeopardized during the Second World War when the Germans occupying Paris tried to confiscate the books of the Armenian library. This is an event that very few people know about, and that, so you are privileged, and that may seem difficult to understand. Indeed, first time I heard that the Nazis tried to capture the Armenian library in Paris, my first question, I had a question immediately, and everyone has the same question, I think. Why would they care about Armenian books? And which book they would take? And what for? So, however, this confiscation of the Armenian library was not an isolated case, and we need to extend a bit the way we consider Armenian history. It's not only for this story, but generally. What happens to Armenians is not isolated. Generally, it happens to many other people in the same period. It must be seen, so this looting of the library by the Germans, in the wider context of generalized German spoliation in Europe during the Second World War. Much has been said, you probably heard a lot about this, about the Nazi looting of art. Even there is a movie about this. However, the general public is less aware that this policy of looting also targeted books and archives, as well, by the way, as musical scores, musical instruments, household furniture, everything. And there is an important literature about this. These spoliations have been well analyzed and described in a number of academic publications since the early 2000s, notably in the pioneering works of the historian and archivist Patricia Kennedy Grimstead and others. In Paris, the looting of libraries by the Germans mainly targeted the collections of foreign and Jewish institutions. The main libraries looted in Paris were the Russian library, the Turgenev library, the Petliura library, which was the Ukrainian one. So at the time they had the same fate. See? The Polish library, the Czech library, the Jewish library of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, and many other institutional and private Jewish book collections, some of them famous and vast, such as the books of the Rothschild family in Paris and the like. There were also many libraries belonging to Russian or Eastern European socialist intellectuals and activists in exile in Paris that were targeted and robbed by the Germans. So the looting of the Armenian library is a special case in this series of plundered libraries for some reasons I will explain. I will explain, but I have time to drink a drop of water. While in most cases, the plundering of these Jewish and foreign libraries was carried out in a very short time and in absence of witnesses, total absence of witnesses. The plundering of the Armenian library is special because it took an unusually long time, more than 3 months. Thanks to the existence of a diary written by Aram Andonian himself, we have a unique opportunity to read about these events in greater detail. Andonian's diary is a manuscript entitled Nubarian Madenatarani Talana. So, the looting of the plundering of the Nubarian library, my diary, in Oracuculus. It is written on 2 notebooks with a total of 251 pages. It is written in Armenian. It was unpublished. It is unpublished, and it had never been studied or translated. So I will follow the thread of this diary and quote some excerpts, exceptionally for you, to introduce you to this strange story of the looting of the National Armenian Library of Paris. Alors, here is the first page of this notebook. This is Aram Andonian's handwriting. And if you read Armenian, you can read that the title is Arachim Mas Shirchal Germanagan Kravman. So, first part, period of the German occupation or requisition of the books of the library. On 10 January 1941, so you have the date, Urpat, das Hunvar Hazainarike Karasumek. On 10 January 1941, Andonian began writing his diary. So it's a diary with entries with dates. Immediately after the first visit of a German officer to the Armenian library, which he describes on this very first page. There is another visit, this time by two German officers, a few days later. And these visits aroused the suspicion of Andonian, who was well aware of the recent looting of the Slavic and Jewish libraries in Paris in August-September 1940, the year before. So he suspected that if these German officers were that much interested in knowing about the Armenian library and asking questions about it, how many books, who comes here, to which political parties it belongs, these kind of questions, he suspected that they intended to go further and perhaps to do the same thing that they did for the the Russian, Polish, and Jewish libraries. As a result, he began to put aside some valuable books, to put them aside in order to protect them from possible German looting. He asked some Armenian neighbors who lived in the same building in Albany Square. In this very building, there were several Armenian families at the time. And some of them famous, by the way. Among them, Edgar Shahin, the painter and engraver, famous. And he asked them to secretly store some of these precious books in their private apartment so that the German would not find them. He asked Edgar Shahin, who refused, arguing that it would be very dangerous to hide these books in his apartments for fear of the Germans. Andonian explains in his diary that he began to transfer many books to the cave in the basement at night. So the library is on the first floor. So he had only one floor to go down. One or two. To go to the cave, it makes two. Okay. So, and he was packing books in heavy bags of about 50 books together, tying them together, and he was like this by night, not to be seen by anyone, going down to the cave to put them in the. And in the meantime, from the cave, where there were a lot of books that he had put there because they were double copies, there were books which were not that important, in order not to leave some free spaces on the shelves, because it would attract the suspicion of the Germans. Where are the books which were there? So he will take some books from the cave and bring them back to the first floor, or to the second floor if you are American, and then, or Armenian. And then, so it means that physically it was a hard work. He was almost 60-year-old. It was not easy for him. He writes after one of his nights of traveling into the cave, "When I returned to the library, I looked like a man out of a sack of flour. My clothes were completely covered in dust. I had to take off my clothes to clean them. My cleaning was even more difficult on that cold day in the library, which had no heating, because it was the war restrictions, of course. It was like an icebox." He used the word sarnaran. "I went straight to bed, hoping to warm up, but the cold had gone right through me." Andonian explains how, in the days that followed, he saved the archives of the Armenian Patriarchate of Istanbul. I must explain that these archives from Istanbul, from Constantinople, these archives which belonged to the Armenian Patriarchate of Istanbul, they had been sent to Europe in 1922. Because in 1922, the Kemalist forces, the nationalist Turkish forces, were approaching Constantinople, so in order to save these archives, they were sent abroad. It's a bit complicated history. They were sent to Manchester, then they were sent to Marseille with Bishop Balakian, and then after the death of Balakian, part of them was sent to Paris, and there was an agreement with the Patriarchate and the AGBU to keep these archives in Paris because it was safer than Constantinople, and another part of the archives was sent to Jerusalem, where it is still today in the Armenian Patriarchate. So, among these archives, there were, for example, the personal papers, a very rich collection of personal papers of the former Patriarch, Maragia Ormanian himself, and other irreplaceable autograph documents. So he tried to save all these archives and to hide them. He also explains in his diary how he rescued the magnificent manuscript, a Haismavuk, a lectionary of the lives and deeds of the saints, which was written in Tokat, Yevtokat, in 1673 and donated to the library in 1913 by Carlos Gulbenkian himself. And it is an illuminated, very heavy manuscript that is still in the library today. So if you come to the library, I will show you. So he hid the book. He explains in the diary that when the Germans were inside the place, with trying to put the books into some boxes, he discreetly put this manuscript of Carlos Gulbenkian under his couch, his sofa, his divan, because he used to live in the library. From the early 1930s, Andonian had stopped to live outside of the library. He lived inside the library. He was reading and writing the whole day and the whole night long. Even the AGBU was complaining because of the librarian we use too much electricity because he reads at night and he writes at night. So yeah, he should stop, he should slow down so that we save some money. Anyway, at the time, his work was not always acknowledged, but it was an important work, and he was a man who really had the conscience of what was important and what was less important. So on 10 February 1941, 1 month after this first visit, the Germans notified the AGBU officially that the library was being transferred to Berlin. Everything is going to be transferred to Berlin. And the looting began the day after. On 11 February, no time to breathe. According to Andonian's account, quote, "This morning at 7 o'clock, before daylight, I was startled awake by a loud banging on the door. Boom, boom, boom. In the darkness, they had not seen the doorbell." This is still an issue. A lot of people, they just knock on the door because they don't see the doorbell when they come to the library. So if you come to the library to see Carlos Gulbenkian's manuscript, please ring the bell. I'm not deaf, but when I opened the door, quote, "When I opened the door, 4 Germans came in, one in military uniform, the others in civilian clothes. There was also a soldier with a rifle on his shoulder who had stopped at the top of the stairs. He was standing guard and did not go in. One of the Germans, speaking in French, told me word for word. Today, all the books in the library are being requisitioned for transport to Berlin." He added that they had nothing to do with this requisition, that the order had come from the Berlin police, he used the word Polizei, and that they were obliged to carry it out as a matter of urgency, as they had been ordered to do. Then, he took out of his pocket a typewritten paper in German with various stamps on it, handed it to me and said, "Here is the written order." A moment later, the door opened and more than 20 French porters, removal men, came in one after the other, French, each one carrying 1 or 2 empty boxes. After piling them up in the corridors and lounges, they went downstairs and returned with more boxes. There was a great commotion coming up the street towards us, but it was impossible to see what was going on through the window. There was no doubt that the street was full of military vans. The movers came and went a few times, while the corridors and lounges of the library were almost all filled with empty boxes, until it became impossible to move around. Then the movers spread out in the first 2 rooms and began to fill the boxes, bringing down the books, or rather throwing them on the floor. One of them, with a bottle of ink and a brush in his hand, wrote the letter S-O-R on the lid of each full box and numbered them. End quote. At the time of the requisition, Andonian had been living, as I said, in the library for several years. So the looting by the Germans appeared to him both as an attack on a national treasure, the library, the national library, given the nature of the institution, but also as a personal attack. And some of the books were his books that he had donated to the library. One of the most interesting aspects of Andonian diary is that it shows us the looting at eye level, on a human scale. The text is particularly rich in material detail. The author also describes his personal impressions, feelings, sometimes with almost humorous anecdotes. For example, Andonian describes how, very strange, the day after the requisitions began, he drank Armenian coffee with a German officer. Quote, Oriental coffee was, he doesn't say Turkish or Armenian, and my translation is Fidel. Oriental coffee was completely unknown to him, and he burned his mouth with the first sip. But he liked it very much, and I had to teach him how to make it. I gave him a small packet of coffee, and he wrote down some details of how to prepare it. So at least once got it during the war. On 12 February, so the day after, the AGBU submitted a request to the German authorities not to requisition the library. Please don't requisition our library, it's a national asset. In support of this request, the AGBU submitted a report written during the night by Aram Andonian himself, in French, to be read by the Germans, explaining the importance of the library to Armenians. And I'm quoting it because it explains well, it describes well the importance of this library in the eyes of the Armenian community, the AGBU, and all of the Armenian community in Paris at the time. In a country that is home to one of the most important concentrations of the Armenian people, dispersed throughout the world as a result of the tragic events of the other war, World War I. The existence of an institution such as the Nubar Library is not only a blessing for the Armenians of France, who number more than 70,000 souls, but above all, it is one of the most effective means of preserving the feeling of their original nationality. We hope that these few explanations have been sufficient to show that the Nubar Library was not only a repository of documents and volumes without moral effect, but one of the living sanctuaries of Armenian influence and spirituality. Very beautiful sentence. On 14 February, the librarian waits feverishly behind his door the removal men to arrive to remove the 168 boxes they have filled up the 2 days before. But the hours pass, and he sees nothing coming, so he writes. 8 o'clock. The doorbell is still silent. 9 o'clock. Then 10. Then 11. 12. Nobody comes. I began to think that they had an obstruction and that they would arrive in the afternoon. I went to the door twice to leave, to go to lunch, but my hand did not reach far enough to open the door. After the second attempt, I decided to stay in the library and walked around the flat. End quote. 3 days earlier, on 11 February, when 168 boxes of books had just been brutally filled by the movers, Andonian described a landscape of desolation in the library. Quote, the six rooms of the library, since it is, the library is in a flat, it's a flat, an apartment. The 6 rooms were filled with crates of books stacked on top of each other. A perfect scene for looting, which I found absolutely depressing as my eyes wandered up and down the rows of shelves. For nearly 15 years, these shelves had been filled with colorful bindings and familiar books, which had cost me much fatigue and suffering, but also pleasure, and in greater measure. Now, in their skeletal emptiness, these shelves had taken on the appearance of an ossuary, and the boxes piled in a pyramid shape gave the impression that coffins lay in the center of the room. What a beautiful description. He continues, the scene was the same in each of the 6 rooms. I gradually moved from one to the next. There was still a lot of stuff. Packets of newspapers, files of correspondence, notebooks, books, pictures had been left in this or that corner like rubbish. Books had been left on many of the high shelves and no one had thought to take them down. Other books had fallen under the tables and had not been picked up either. End quote. So walking through the library on this very day with his friend, you may know him, Dr. Aram from Constantinople, who was one of the deportees of the 24th of April, was a very well-known figure of the Armenian intelligentsia in Constantinople. And so walking through the library with Torcomian cannot help but compare the devastated library to the ruins of the medieval city of Ani, a symbol of the collective misfortune of the Armenians. And this is reported in the diary. Through Andonian's eyes, we can see how different the fate of the Armenian library was from that of Slavic and Jewish libraries and private collections. I told you that although the history of this robbery, this looting of the Armenian library, has to be seen in a wider context, because there were other plunderings, not only the Armenians, in the meantime it is very specific. Why? The Jewish libraries, which were plundered in Paris, were sent to Frankfurt am Main, where the Nazis had set up a research institute for the Jewish question. You can imagine what kind of research institute. This institute had been set up under the auspices of the Oberschule, the high school of the Nazi party, which was to train the leaders, the future cadre, the future leaders of the party. Alfred Rosenberg, one of the key leaders of the party, played a major role in the creation of this so-called Jewish institute. He had also organized and directed the looting of Jewish art, books, and property in Europe through the creation of the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, which was a kind of, if I may translate, the staff of Reichsleiter is Reichsleader Rosenberg is his name, and it was a kind of administration whose role, military administration in occupied domains, occupied territories, whose main occupation was, activity was to organize the spoliation of Jewish properties, but also of Slavic libraries. Because the books looted in the Slavic, Russian, Polish, and so on libraries were to be sent to the Oriental Library, the Ostbücherei in Berlin, created during the war. And Andonian refers several times in his diary to the looting of these libraries, these other libraries. So it is very interesting. For example, on 19 February, he doesn't speak only about the Armenians, he speaks also of what is happening to the other libraries. On 19 February, he writes, quote, meeting a Russian friend of mine, the man was jealous of us because he had heard that not all the books in the Lubar library had been taken away. Out of the 72,000 volumes of our ancient library, the Russian library, Turgenev library, not a single notebook was saved, he told me. You Armenians are more fortunate. He also described the circumstances of the confiscation of the Polish library, which he had witnessed and which were unknown to me. Andonian is still speaking. When the Germans arrived at the Polish library, a speech had been prepared on the spot. They immediately ordered the speaker and the audience to leave without wasting any time. Then they emptied the library completely of its stuff and left after sealing the building. The next day, the Russian told me, they put boxes in the street on either side of the door, and a few days later there was not a single sheet of paper left in the library. He was curious as to how we had managed, we Armenians, to become the subject of a more lax protocol, a more liberal protocol. I told him that the reason was completely unknown to me, end quote. So let's try to explain this mystery. Unlike the looting of the Armenian library, all the looting of Slavic and Jewish libraries in Paris by the Germans were carried out in a very short time, usually in a few days, between August and October 1940. As I said, there were no witnesses to this looting, and for the most part, when historians write the history of this loot, of these robberies, they rely exclusively on German bureaucratic sources. So they only have the perpetrator's source, the perpetrator's eye, to understand what was going on, because there is no witnessing from the victims of these lootings. Another important difference is that unlike these Slavic and Jewish libraries, which were plundered completely, the Armenian library was only selectively plundered. The reason for this is that the German authorities, following the request of the AGBU of 12 February, decided to, send a specialist from the University of Berlin to Paris to select the books to be transferred to Berlin. So first, they say, we're going to transfer all the library to Berlin. The AGBU protests. So finally, they change their mind, they change their position. They say, okay, we are going to send a specialist from Berlin. He will select the books that we really need. This specialist was, as you can expect, an Armenian. An Armenian, Professor Ardashes Aperian, the nephew of Manuk Aperian. He arrived in Paris on 18 March 1941. On the eve of the Second World War, the Nubar Library had a collection of around, I told you, 20,000 printed books, several hundred manuscripts, and important series of Armenian newspapers and periodicals. The final numbers, I'm cutting it short, the final numbers of items looted in 1941 was 1,331 printed books out of 20,000, of which 917 were in Armenian language and 414 in European languages, as well as 481 periodicals volumes, bound or in bundles, and 33 old Armenian manuscripts. So all in all, perhaps between 6 and 8% of the library's collection. So, going back to the diary. Another, this is Ardashes Aperian. I will elaborate a bit more about him. Another important aspect of Aram Andonian's diary is that it reveals, before going to him, excuse me, this one. Another important aspect of the diary is that it reveals the internal tensions, divides inside the Armenian community. On 11 February 1941, when the imminent transfer of the Armenian library to Berlin was announced by the German authorities in Paris, a delegation of the AGBU was sent to Hotel Commodore in Paris, the headquarters of this German administration, the Reichsleiter Rosenberg's operation staff in Paris. And a number of other Armenian organizations went with the AGBU. So the delegation, the Armenian delegation, included the AGBU representative and other Armenian associations, political parties, delegates. So there were the delegates from the Armenian Apostolic Church of Paris, the presidents of the two Armenian refugee offices, Arshak Chobanyan, who was very close to the AGBU, and Alexander Khatisyan, who was, as you know, very close to the Tashnak Sutun, member of the Tashnak Sutun, not very close, prominent members of the Union of Armenian Physicians, like Aram Torkomian, I told you about him, the doctor, the president of the Union of Armenian Youth in Paris, the representative of the Armenian colony of Paris, who was Hair Dertovma, Father Balabanian, representative of the Catholic Armenian community in Paris, and so on. Andonian explains Andonian was not present to this meeting with the Germans, but he explained, he hears about it, and he explained in his diary that the German officers were very aware of the internal Armenian political divisions and rivalries. And on several occasions, they mentioned their appreciation of one Armenian political party, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, the Tashnak Suchun. Andonian himself didn't like the Tashnak Suchun. He was an old opponent of the Tashnak Suchun. And he insists several times in his diary on the ambiguous behavior towards the Germans of Alexander Khatisyan, former Prime Minister of the Armenian Republic in 1918-1920, and a leading member of the Tashnak Suchun. He, Andonian, bitterly criticized the opportunistic Germanophilia in some Armenian circles. Quote, "Here, as in Berlin, the German victory had simply driven many of our people mad. For some, this sudden Germanophilia was simply a matter of profit. For others, who believed that the situation thus created was destined to last, or who wanted it to last forever, Germanophilia was a real political inclination, and they believed that by placing the fate of the nation in the hands of Germany, they could satisfy their resentments and hatreds." End quote. In a thinly veiled criticism of the Tashnak party, Andonian writes, quote, "Of course, Mr. Khatisyan and many of his party leaders and members, as well as non-Tashnak Armenians, are under the spell of the Germans. Perhaps that is why they not only believe in, but wish for Germany's final victory." End quote. So Andonian, in this story of the looting of the Armenian library, he sees an Armenian hand behind the looting. He's accusing more the Armenians than the Germans to be behind the looting. On 21st March, he notes incredulously, Chobanian, the French-Armenian writer Arshak Chobanian came to the library early with astonishing news. The Germans were planning to set up an Armenian library in Berlin, which they would call Nubarian, and the books confiscated from us would be kept there under the same name. I thought he was joking, but he was serious. If only this could be the result of his credulity. It was just the second mention of the famous so-called Armenian Institute, which the German government, or more precisely Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, who supervised such actions under his heavy and implacable paw, was supposedly going to establish in the triumphal precincts of Greater Berlin to the glory of the Armenian nation. But it is no secret to us that these men, the Nazis, are showing clear contempt, clear despise for our nation at this time. Even the Aryan origin of the Armenians, which seemed to be a source of pride, vanity, and above all, security for our people, is considered doubtful by them. He means the Nazis. And this worries many people who fear that the Armenians, if not directly persecuted like the Jews, may be subject to severe restrictions. End quote. For Andonian, this robbery, this looting, was orchestrated by the Tashnak Suchun with German support, to the detriment of another Armenian organization, the AGBU. So it was Armenian plunder rather than German plunder. This is his theory in his diary. It is necessary here to give some explanations, and you have on this page of the diary, if you can read Armenian, it is written Yegrotmas, so it's after the first half of the diary. He opens a new page, he writes, first page was Arachin Mas, Sherchan, Germanagan Keravman, period of the German occupation. Yegrotmas, second period of the Armenian requisition, the Armenian occupation. It is necessary here to give some explanation of the role attributed by Andonian, rightly or wrongly, in his diary to Professor Aperian. Artashes Aperian was a well-known Armenologist. He published numerous works on Armenian folklore, folk tales, literature, and language. He had previously served in the Armenian parliament from 1918 to 1920 with the Tashnak Tutun. In 1921, following the Sovietization of Armenia, he moved to Germany, where he took up a teaching post at the Department of Oriental Languages at the University of Berlin. By this time, he had established many contacts with German Orientalists and had become a figure, someone well known and respected in the small Armenian colony in Germany, essentially in Berlin. After 1933, Aperian worked to prove the Aryan origin of the Armenians, notably in a collective work entitled Armenirtum Arirtum, published in Potsdam in 1934 by the German Armenian Society. Aperian was also vice president of this German Armenian Society, Deutsch-Armenische Gesellschaft, which was chaired by the German Protestant theologian Paul Rohrbach. Together with Paul Rohrbach, Aperian co-edited the German language periodical Hayastan, Armenia, from 1937 to 1944. During the Second World War, Aperian became the chairman of the Armenian National Council, which included anti-Soviet Armenian nationalists such as Garegin Nejde and Rastamat Kanayan, well-known, better known by his nickname, Dro. This Armenian National Council, established in Berlin, aimed to seize power in Armenia after the German victory over the USSR. In this context, Aperian also published the Armenian monthly Azad Hayastan, Free Armenia, aimed at the soldiers of the Armenian Legion who were fighting alongside the Nazis. In March 1941, Aperian was entrusted by the Germans with the task of selecting the books, as I told you, of the Armenian library, those books which would be transferred finally to Berlin. Aram Andonian and Arshak Chobanyan, the writer, were appointed by the AGBU to cooperate and to assist Aperian in this arduous task of selecting the books, because there were thousands and thousands of books. Remember that the books had been put in boxes by removal men. There were 168 boxes full of books. So there was a big table in the reading room. They were opening each box, taking the book one by one, and just putting them on the table. And Aperian was deciding if this book was worthy of interest for him and to bring to Berlin or not. In reality, the three men had a very bad and tense relationship for 2 or 3 weeks, punctuated by clashes, insults, and vehement disputes over this or that book, which was considered rare and therefore valuable. And it is described as very much detailed, even repeatedly detailed in the diary. Chobanyan and Andonian tried to resist Aperian's demands, sometimes using even stratagems, while Aperian argued that he was in a strong position to choose the books he wanted, because it had been an agreement between the Germans and the AGBU, we do like this, we do like this. These are at least the terms of Andonian's diary, Andonian's account. It would be futile to attempt an objective presentation of the facts, for Andonian makes no secret of his fundamental hostility to the Tashnak party, his enmity, also personal enmity for Aperian, and the fact that he regards the Tashnaks in this affair as traitors who have gone into the service of the Germans. This aspect of Andonian's account may be related to the importance of the themes of betrayal and conspiracy in both his literary and documentary works about the genocide. Despite its lack of objectivity, Andonian diary is an original and irreplaceable testimony to these little-known events. Just a few words. This is a photo just illustrating the proximity between Aperian and Garegin Nejde in this Armenian National Council founded in Berlin, here in the Meritarist congregation in Vienna. Of course, Vienna, since the Anschluss in 1938, was incorporated in Germany. So this is that's the following of the manuscript. Yeah, and I was talking about the fact that Andonian. No, I will talk about this later if I have time. But don't worry, I'm almost done. So, however, so it is an irreplaceable, it is a precious source about what happened. In the meantime, this diary raised a number of questions, a lot of questions. It is difficult to know exactly when and under what circumstances the manuscript was written. Indeed, Andonian's diary contains many obvious interpolations. That is, things that are written in the diary, but for obvious reason, things that he could not know at the time he's supposed to write the diary. This is an interpolation. Okay? And there are many things like this in the diary. The division of the diary in two parts, period of the German requisition and part 2, period of the Armenian requisition, clearly shows that Andonian knew the end of the story in advance, and in particular what he considered to be a betrayal by certain Armenian circles. In conclusion, this manuscript lacks a colophon. In medieval manuscript you have the colophon in the last page generally, where the scribe explains who has written this manuscript, when, in which circumstance, what was the state of the world at the time, who asked him to do the manuscript, and the like. We don't know. We don't have this colophon in this manuscript. So we have only questions. Yes, I know it is disappointing. But sometimes questions are more important and interesting than answers, no? However, it is quite clear that the manuscript is not a first draft. If you look at the pages, you can see no erasure, no mistake, and it is very well written. I don't know if you read Armenian, but reading Armenian's handwriting, Andonian handwriting, might be challenging when he writes speedily. But when it is written like this, it is very regular, and if you get used to it, you can read it easily. Anna can confirm. So it's not the first draft. It has been revised, possibly several years after the spoliation, and most probably towards the end of the war, or even after the war. It is clear from this reading that Andonian's text is a narrative rather than a diary. This narrative supports a thesis, that of Armenian treachery, of conspiracy. It is therefore an indictment that has the appearance of a diary. It is a combat text, a text to fight, not a writing that is supposed to remain personal as a personal diary. This reminds us of Andonian's past as a polemicist when he was a journalist in Constantinople, and where he had many enemies because he was criticizing everyone very harshly before the genocide. And even in Paris, in the press, in the Armenian press, and in Berlin in the years after the First World War, and at the time of the Soromon-Tellerian trial to which he attended. And so he was very involved in Armenian politics. He was not only a writer and a scholar in a way. He was very involved in politics because the knowledge about the literature, about history, the accumulation of books and archives was not separable from political issues at the time. The question raised by the writing of this pseudo-diary leads us more broadly to re-examine Andonian's relationship to writing and testimony, a question that has already been explored in relation to his writings on the genocide, and which is raised again here in relation to what seems, with the possible destruction of the library, to be a second catastrophe for him. The question is all the more pertinent as Andonian, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, in the wake of the Nuremberg trial, began again to collect testimony about the genocide. I just want to show you this page. This is a letter on the left, which is written after World War II. In the time of the Nuremberg trial, Andonian is once again starting to collect testimonies about the genocide, something he had apparently stopped to do after 1922, 1923. So there is a second period, and probably, this is my hypothesis, probably the Nuremberg trial at this period of post-World War II period has been determinant, has been kind of triggering in the fact that he starts again to collect. And in this letter on the left, he's writing to Father Vartan Karagözian, who was deported with him. They were deported in the same chart, he explained in one of his writings. And he said, oh, you survived. Me, I survived because I broke my leg. You know, it's a very famous story. By chance, I survived. And you, how did you survive? And what did you know? Were you able to know more about the people who were deported with us, and in which condition, in which circumstances they were assassinated, and these kind of things? Because at the time, he really tries to get such information. But in the meantime, he tries to get information about those who were traitors, those who denounced Armenians, even among the Armenians. And he's obsessed, there is an obsession of Andonian for betrayal, you know. And this letter is coming from a file, I didn't translate it in English, sorry, Madnichner, Severesnere, Madnichner. It means the indicators, how can I, those who betray, those who denounce. And also on this, the small notebook you see on the right, it's a very enigmatic notebook with his handwriting. There is no date of this notebook. I cannot ascertain when it was written, but I think it was written in Paris. And he drafts lists of perpetrators in this notebook for several places. And also collaborators. Armenian collaborators, as if the end of his life was really oriented toward this quest, not only for information about the victims, but also for those who betrayed. And I'm wondering if there is not also this kind of obsession in the diary we have been talking about the robbery of the looting of the Armenian library. Okay, so Andonian died in after the war, the Allied governments, I'm almost done. I ask you 2 minutes, no more. Even to prove my sincerity, I will take 10 seconds of these 2 minutes to drink a drop of water. So 1 minute 50 seconds now. So we need, I think, to consider this diary, when it was written, how it was written, why it was written in the post-war context, post-World War II context. What happens in the post-World War II context? At the time, the Allied governments, France, Great Britain, were setting up restitution commissions to return stolen property to their former owners, at least those who were still alive. So sadly, many Jews have been killed during, of course, their properties were not restituted to the former owners, but the AGBU was one of the organizations that could claim its right to restitution of robbed properties, the books. So the AGBU used Andonian's diary and selected several passages, several excerpts of this diary from his manuscript to present its case, to defend its case to these restitution commissions, and later even to the Federal Republic of Germany after 1949. At the same time, in 1947-48, there was a bitter controversy in the press, in the Armenian press, between Aram Andonian and the AGBU on the one hand, in the Ramgavar and communist press, here for instance, and Ardashes Aperian on the other hand in the Tashnak press. So on this the first newspaper, Jorovurt, you can see it's a journal of the Front National Arménien. It's an Armenian organization in France, depending from the Communist Party, the French Communist Party. And they have this Oratert, it's their daily. And it is, the title of the article is really strong. It is how the Tashnak professor, Artaches Aperian, has spoliated the Nouveau Library of Paris with the help of the Gestapo. Report by Mr. Aram Andonian. And the content is more or less repeated in the Ramgavar press, in Miutun, which is the organ of the AGBU, so Ramgavar. It is written more or less the same. The German looting of the AGBU Nouveau Library in Paris, report by the librarian Mr. Aram Andonian. And there are many examples of such accusations in the Armenian press against Aperian, against the Tashnak Sutun in 1947-48, and it is always in the Ramgavar and communist press. And on the other hand, in the Tashnak press, Aperian replies. He replies to the accusations, and he gives his arguments too, and he defends himself. And so there are plenty of examples of this here in the Harach daily newspaper, well-known daily newspaper in Paris. Okay, Andonian died in 1951. The AGBU tried, after Andonian's death, to recover the books until the mid-1960s, unsuccessfully. And this, finally, in 1976, so 35 years after the looting, 76, the director of the State Library in Minsk, Belarus, informed the director of the Matena Daran in the Soviet Republic of Armenia that 27 Armenian manuscripts and 25 prints belonging to the Armenian Library in Paris had been found in Minsk. The director of the Matena Daran, Levon Khachigyan, soon wrote a letter to Artaches Kardashian, one of Aram Andonian's successor at the Nouveau Library, to tell him the good news. Quote, "I have no doubt that you and our friends of Armenian culture in France will welcome this news with joy. After long wanderings, freed from their torment, these precious fragments have found their final stage under the roof of the fatherland." End quote. Ironically, these books, written or printed in Constantinople or the Ottoman Empire, which belonged to an Armenian National Library in Paris in the diaspora, had finally found their way to what was presented as their natural home in Soviet Armenia. So the tortured fate of these books reflects the situation of many exiles and repatriates within a transnational Armenian space in the 20th century, of which the Armenian Library of Paris was a product. Thank you.
I was a little confused about, so out of the how many boxes that they packed, how many did Aperian and the others decide were going to be removed, and then none of them were ever returned even after the request, except for these manuscripts found in Minsk and sent to the Matena Daran. Did I get that right?
Yes, exactly. So when they had filled the 168 boxes, it was thousands and thousands of books. But finally, he selected, Aperian, only 1,500 books, something like this, volumes. And out of these 1,500 volumes, none of them has been restituted to the library. Actually, there was a box of 200 boxes which were sent to the library by the Restitution Commission in 1947 or 48, because they were Armenian books, but they didn't know to which it belonged, so they sent it to the Armenian library.
Did it belong to the, was it?
No, it was not to the AGBU library, but it was given to the library because there was no living owner or identified owner. But for the rest, no, they were not recovered, retrieved, and except these 27, which were not sent to Paris, but to Armenia.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Did Aperian ever establish a Berlin library?
Given the state of Berlin at the end of the war, I doubt he could have established a library. If he had done so, there would be no more books. But at the end of the war, he moved to Stuttgart, as far as I know, and perhaps also he had a job in Munich for a time. So he was in this American section of occupied Germany, not the eastern section. Good for him, because he was anti-communist, so he would have had some problems. So perhaps some of the books went with him. I've been in contact with recently with research provenance provenance researcher librarians in Germany, and one of them asked me to send him some ex libris of the books we have. The ex libris, you know, is the kind of stamp you can have in your private library. At the time it was done, collectioners, they would have their own stamp with their name, with their symbol, like a blason, to put under the cover of the book. And the library, of course, has the same kind of stamp, and Aram Andonian has his own stamp. So I sent some samples. And the day after 24 hours, I was contacted by a German student, and he told me that one of one of the Nubarian's book, I'm like Andonian, was located in the Harvard library. So I guess there is a research to do one by one, and it is possible to find out some books. I have also been told by some colleagues when I first presented this work that some of the books were still in Minsk, still in Belarus, and I have met one of the former employee librarian of this library in Minsk. He came to Paris, we met, he showed me photos, and I recognized some of the books which are described in the diary of Andonian, and there is no doubt. These are our books, but there is no specific catalogs of the books belonging to the Armenian library in Minsk. So why they are in Minsk? Because when the USSR invaded Germany at the end of the war, the Soviets looted what the Germans had looted. So it's double looting. For instance, they looted the French archives of the French Minister of Foreign Affairs that the Germans had looted, and these archives were sent to Moscow. And they were restituted in the early 2000s after an agreement between French president and President Putin. They were sent back to Paris in 2006, I think. So it is now, it has no relation with Russia, these archives. It's about the French prime ministers. It is called now the Fonds de Moscou, the Moscow collection. But even if it has no relation to Moscow. And so Minsk was, in French we say, a plaque tournante, kind of crossroads of all these goods stolen by the Germans, stolen again by the Soviets, dispatched everywhere, and Minsk was a kind of hub for dispatching all these properties. That's why. So I would like to go to Minsk now, but I will wait a bit.
Have another question?
I'll ask a question. Thank you. It's just a fascinating story. What happened to the books that were taken to the cave?
Oh, that's where I want. Okay.
The book. Okay. The books he saved. Fortunately, he explains that in some letters that given the fact that there are many mouse in the cave, the books cannot stay in the cave too long because the mouse like very much literature. So he says, I had to bring them back to the library. So he did the same physical exercise. But he was getting old, you know. The end of his life is hard, physically and mentally is hard. But all these books were replaced in the library, on the shelves of the library. Yes?
The manuscripts that were sent to Madanat Aram,
are they on display there now, or are they held there now? And is the story did the story stay with the manuscripts?
Excellent question. No, I don't think so. I don't think so. It's not kind of a public history. Of course, Madanat Aram has so many things to display that, but also the history of this plundering is new. It has never been written and published elsewhere before. So I don't think they are even aware of I mean, the whole story. So.
Very interesting, thank you.
But I should email them in the near future.
Boris, what's the situation like today? Who are the visitors? Are there Armenians? Are the peers Armenians interested in the library, the new generation? Can you give us?
Yes. The public, the audience of the library is really international, and it is really mixed. We have some Armenian visitors from the diaspora, also from Armenia, of course. From the diaspora, I met, for instance, Mr. Dertaftian Haruk and his wife in the library a few years ago. I met Anna in the library a few years ago as well. I met Annie in the library also. So yes, some of you have been to the library, and Mr. Eskidjan too, and Mr. Eskidjan too. So there are visitors. Some of them are researchers. Some of them just want to visit this Armenian heritage. But I wouldn't say that the majority of the visitors are Armenian. There are a lot of international scholars, PhD students, professors, many Turkish visitors, for instance, many of them learning Armenian, either to read Armenian sources, either to read Armeno-Turkish literature, you know, the Armenian Turkish literature written with Armenian alphabet. So we have many good colleagues at the library of any country, and people from, since it is one of the most important libraries in the diaspora, there is no really equivalent except these monastery libraries in Venice, Vienna. And since it is more open to the public because it is not an ecclesiastic library, we have a lot of, let's say, visitors who are doing real research. And also people who do research about their family, their background, who are not trained or professional researchers at all. They are you and me, and they go to the library to find out a trace of their parents, and if they don't find their parents, they find at least something about the context, the flavor of what their parents have lived in. And also journalists. It could be. Actually, I have many people to contact. But it is true, which is funny with this story, is each time I present the diary of Andonian, the questions turn a lot about where are the books now. Personally, I had no time to investigate seriously. I was fascinated by the diary itself, and I want to publish it in bilingual edition. Armenian and French first, and English later. So if you know the sponsor, please tell me. And as a historian, I was more interested by the writing itself. But the quest for the books is another story, and it will need a thorough investigation and perhaps a teamwork rather than an individual. Yes, Annie?
Is the continuity, the longevity of the library dependent mostly or solely upon AGBU, or is there now collaboration with others to ensure that it continues for hopefully forever? And then I also wanted to know what, if any, of of the library is available around the world online? Or access to some of the archives, if any?
The library relies, the existence of the library relies solely on the AGBU. So it is very significant, I think, that it's a diaspora organization, diaspora rooted set of organization that holds this library, created this library, and still maintains it. It means a lot. In the meantime, it's also it's an advantage that we have this institution, the AGBU, behind. In the meantime, it's also a diasporic institution, so with its advantage and its weaknesses. The weakness is the advantages, the strengths are the working, the networks we have around the library, many collaborations with other Armenian organizations. The weaknesses are that we are not backed by a state, so we are just backed by an organization. And there are no, for the time being, there are no other organizations sponsoring the library. But it would make sense to establish such partnerships, just thinking to France, for instance, for the French state. Recently, in 2024, the library has been labelized heritage, a local, regional heritage of Paris area. And the president of the Paris area visited on 24th of April the library. So this allows us periodically to ask for subventions, public subventions. I really think it's in this direction that we have a future. Yeah. But for France, it's very I mean, all the French officials who visit the library, and there are many, they are always amazed by the library because it's unique. No other foreign community, immigrant community in France has such an institution. It's unique. And we have no state behind.
And the online?
Sorry. Online, this is the question I always try to skip. Online, we have a very limited presence, and it is mainly due to the lack of manpower in the library. And so it's not a lack of goodwill, it's a lack of manpower. Yeah. And funding, yeah, it goes together.
Thank you very much for this research. It's a very interesting story. I wanted to know, do we at least have, did Andonian keep in the library a list, a catalog of all those books that were taken to Berlin that will help look for them, find them, I guess? And also, how, if you, just briefly, kind of the main ways that Aperian was trying to defend himself, that he wasn't, this wasn't a conspiracy, he wasn't behind this.
Yes, I must say I'm more convinced by Andonian's arguments, but yes, I have to be fair. Aperian has also some arguments. His arguments are more or less that he intervened only to respond to the demand of the AGBU, so to do a favor to the AGBU, and that he did his best to save as much possible the books and to avoid their transfer to Berlin. That's his argumentation, and he tries to solicit several witnesses to support his argumentation after the war. And the other question, well, yeah, about the lists. Yes, so I knew there were lists because in the diary it is written that everything was listed, and Andonian was a man of list. He was writing all the time long, and the list was done in 3 copies, he says, and at the end they signed. Chobanian, Andonian, and Aperian signed, and Aperian insisted that they should sign under the mention of we freely decided that these books will be sent to Germany. But I didn't see this list, and I saw a typed list sent by the AGBU to the restitution commissions. I saw it in the French archives, So you have all the lists with all the books in Armenian and not in Armenian, but you don't have the manuscript list with the stamps. And I was wondering where it is, because Andonian explains that Aperian took his copy, and the two other copies were remain in the AGBU. So I was wondering, and you know what? 2 months ago, I found out the box, an entire box of archive. It was written, actually it was written Sion. Sion is a Jerusalem journal by the Armenian community. I'm interested in Jerusalem. I'm doing a research project on Jerusalem. I saw this box, Sion. Interesting. What's in it? I took the box, but behind it was written German books, books to Germany. I said, what? I opened the box, and it is another box full of archives, and there are the lists inside. But I didn't have the time to read everything before the conference. So it's the Sharunageli, it's continuing.
Wow.
This is for the next book. It's a place full of surprises, the library. Really, really.
Okay, thank you, Boris. And if you don't have further questions, let's thank Boris for this wonderful, interesting, and ongoing project, because it is ongoing. And we're hopeful that we will become part of it, because now, if I go to the library, I order your book, I'm gonna look for Andonian stamp. That for sure. So, yeah.
You would look for? I didn't.
The stamp of Andonian.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll find more, all together, collectively. Okay, so thank you.
Yes. Thank you.